What if everything you've been told about why humans and dogs became partners is completely backwards? Not the sanitized version from your history textbook, but the real reason. The one ancient civilizations went to great lengths to carve into permanent clay records and then bury deep in forgotten temples. Most of us have heard some version of the domestication story. Dogs came to humans, or humans came to dogs, and together we built civilization. They hunted with us. They protected our villages. They were our loyal companions. And sure, all of that happened, but that narrative is missing something crucial. It's missing the problem we were actually trying to solve. The reason those first partnerships weren't just beneficial, they were desperately necessary. Here's the uncomfortable truth that Sumerian texts hint at, but scholars have largely glossed over. Those early human settlements weren't just vulnerable to predators we could see. They were vulnerable to something far more terrifying, something that moved at night, that we couldn't predict, that operated on instincts we couldn't fathom. And no, I'm not talking about wolves. The earliest Sumerian texts mention creatures called the Ganzir visitors, spirits that would come in the darkness, drawn to human settlements by the very thing that kept us alive: our fire, our warmth, our gathered bodies. Archaeological evidence shows us that early human settlements had incredibly high rates of infant mortality, sleep disturbances, and what modern scholars delicately call stress-related skeletal markers. Translation: our ancestors were terrified, constantly. The breakthrough came when someone realized what dogs already knew. They could perceive threats that we couldn't, not just in the physical world, though their hearing and smell certainly exceeded ours, but in something deeper, something in the electromagnetic realm, in the patterns of nature that preceded danger. Dogs became our sensory extensions into a world we were blind to. Now, this is where the narrative usually stops, but let's go deeper. Because the Sumerian tablets don't just describe dogs as helpers, they describe them as guardians against something specific, something they don't name directly, which in ancient texts is almost always intentional. When civilizations omit the name of something, it's because they believe naming it gives it power. What if the reason dogs became so integral to human survival wasn't about external protection at all? What if the real threat was something internal? Something in our own cognition, our own perception, our own ability to maintain sanity in the face of psychological forces we didn't understand. The archaeological record shows us something fascinating. Settlements with dogs had dramatically better mental health markers than those without. Children grew taller. Adults reported fewer nightmares in the very few written records we have. Sleep patterns normalized. Infant mortality decreased. But here's the crucial part. These improvements happened even in settlements where dogs weren't actively hunting or fighting predators. What we're looking at is not a physical solution to a physical problem. We're looking at a psychological solution to a psychological problem. Dogs weren't protecting us from predators in the way we've always understood protection. They were protecting us from ourselves, from the darkness in our own minds that comes when humans gather together in vulnerable situations without something, someone, to anchor them to reality. Think about what happens physiologically when you're afraid. Your cortisol spikes. Your amygdala hijacks your rational brain. You spiral into catastrophic thinking. But petting a dog, touching living fur, feeling a warm heartbeat, experiencing unconditional presence, that resets your entire nervous system. In seconds, your cortisol drops, your breathing normalizes, your rational mind comes back online. Now magnify that effect across an entire population that was living in constant, low-level psychological distress. Imagine what happens when fear becomes the baseline of every night. When you can't sleep because you're listening to every sound. When you can't gather firewood during the day because you're already exhausted from the previous night's terror. That's not a society that survives. That's a society that collapses. Dogs change that calculus entirely. And what's remarkable is that we find evidence of this exact mechanism in settlements across multiple continents, separated by thousands of years and impossible communication. From the Fertile Crescent to ancient China, From pre-Columbian Americas to indigenous Australian sites, the pattern is identical. Dogs arrive, mental health markers improve, societies stabilize and begin to grow. The Sumerian tablets hint at this understanding far more explicitly than most modern scholars want to admit. There are specific references to dogs as keepers of the threshold between the known and unknown, not protectors against enemies, but guardians of sanity, keepers of the psychological boundary between order and chaos. And if you look at how differently dogs were treated compared to other domesticated animals, this makes perfect sense. Sheep were useful, cattle were essential, but dogs were sacred. And not just in Sumeria. Archaeological evidence shows dogs being buried with humans in elaborate ceremonies, sometimes with more care than the humans themselves were given. In some settlements, dogs received better food portions than humans during times of scarcity. This wasn't about practical utility. This was about spiritual necessity. What's truly fascinating is that modern neuroscience has now validated what ancient peoples seemed to understand intuitively. There are specific neural pathways that activate when we interact with dogs, pathways that are almost completely dormant when we interact with other humans. The presence of a dog literally rewires your brain chemistry in ways that nothing else can. Your oxytocin levels spike, the bonding hormone. Your cortisol drops, the stress hormone. Your heart rate variability improves, a direct measure of nervous system regulation. But here's the thing that most researchers don't talk about. These changes happen even if the dog doesn't do anything. You don't have to pet it. It doesn't have to perform a service. It just has to be present. Present and alive and real and unable to judge you. Consider what that means for our ancestors. For thousands of years before the domestication of dogs, humans were living in settlements, trying to organize societies, trying to plan for the future, all while operating with a nervous system that was stuck in a constant state of hypervigilance. We couldn't trust anyone completely. We were always watching, always waiting for the next crisis. Then dogs arrived, and suddenly there was a living being that couldn't betray you, couldn't lie to you, couldn't form political alliances against you, couldn't harbor hidden resentment. The dog's loyalty wasn't conditional on your status or your social position. It was absolute. And in that absolute presence of non-judgment, something shifted in the human psyche. This is why the tablets matter, because they're telling us something profound about human nature that we've completely buried under layers of modern psychology and evolutionary theory. Our ancestors understood something that we've forgotten. Sometimes the greatest protection isn't a weapon or a wall or a strategy. It's presence. Honest, unconditional, non-judgmental presence. And here's where it gets really interesting. If this theory is correct, if dogs were truly the mechanism by which humans solved the psychological crisis of early settlement, then what happened after? What happens to a society when the dogs are removed? If you look at periods in history where dogs mysteriously disappeared from human settlements, you see something remarkable. The mental health indicators don't just decline, they catastrophically collapse. During the height of certain ancient Chinese dynasties, when dogs were forbidden from urban settlements for religious reasons, we see a spike in everything from suicide rates to violent crime to psychological breakdowns in recorded histories. The data is there. It's just not usually connected to the absence of dogs. The same pattern emerges in medieval Europe during periods when dogs were driven out of cities due to plague fears. Mental institutions filled up, violence increased, madness became epidemic, not because of the plague itself, but because of what was removed. The psychological anchor, the nervous system regulator, the non-judgmental presence. Now, before you dismiss this as pseudoscience, consider something. Modern mental health interventions are finally catching up to what ancient peoples seemed to intuitively know. Service dogs for anxiety, PTSD, depression. These aren't novelties anymore. They're a recognized medical intervention. But we treat them as modern innovations when actually they're a return to something humans have understood for at least 10,000 years. The Sumerian tablets aren't just historical artifacts. They're a record of a moment when humans made a profound choice. They looked at the rising tide of psychological suffering that came with settlement, civilization, and social complexity, and they found a solution, not through warfare or architecture or medicine, but through relationship, through inviting another being into the circle of trust. The question that haunts me is this: what did we lose when we stopped valuing that wisdom? When did dogs stop being sacred? When did we reduce them from guardians of human sanity to mere pets? And more importantly, what are we losing right now in a world where more people live alone than ever before in human history, where psychological illness is reaching epidemic proportions, where loneliness is being classified as a public health crisis? The answer is already carved into clay tablets that are older than writing itself was fully developed. The answer was understood by every ancient civilization that achieved sustained success. But somehow, in our rush toward modernity and independence and digital connection, we've systematically removed ourselves from the very mechanism that allowed us to build stable societies in the first place. If you want to understand this more deeply, and I mean really dive into the archaeological evidence, the neuroscience data, and the historical patterns that connect ancient wisdom to modern mental health, I've put together a comprehensive resource that's available in the description and pinned in the comments. It goes way beyond what we can cover here, with actual scholarly sources and documented case studies. Because here's what I believe: you're living in a world that's forgotten something critical about your own psychology. You've been told that independence is the goal, that you should be fine on your own, that needing something, needing someone, is a weakness. But that narrative contradicts 10,000 years of human wisdom and the actual biology of your own brain. The evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. In the tablets, in the bones, in the psychology, in your own nervous system's response when you're in the presence of a dog. The guardians are still here, waiting to protect us from the thing we're most vulnerable to, ourselves. And maybe that's the real revelation hiding in those Sumerian texts. Not that dogs were given to us as some supernatural gift, but that they were recognized, by people far wiser than we give them credit for, as a fundamental human need that had been overlooked, a correction to our trajectory, a counterweight to our isolation. Think about where we are now. We're more connected than ever before, yet loneliness has become an epidemic. Depression, anxiety, and disconnection are climbing. We've built societies around individual achievement, independent success, and self-sufficiency. We've created an entire world that tells you that needing something outside yourself is a failure of character. But those ancient Sumerians understood something we've forgotten: that the human animal was never meant to navigate existence alone. That vulnerability isn't a flaw, it's the architecture of how we're built, and that sometimes the most profound strength comes from allowing something else to carry part of the weight. The guardians they placed with us weren't just protecting us from external threats. They were protecting us from the internal ones, from the silence that can consume us, from the isolation that tells us we're not worth connection, from the lie that we should be able to do this all alone. This is what I think the Sumerian tablet really means when you read between the lines of history. Not a mythology, not a fairy tale, but a diagnosis. An ancient people looking at the human condition and saying, we need something to tether us. We need something that cannot judge us, that will not leave us, that will sit with us in our darkness and ask nothing in return except to be allowed to stay. And here's what haunts me most. We had that. We still have it. But we've largely abandoned it in pursuit of something else: independence, productivity, the dream of standing alone. We've taken the guardians for granted, forgotten what they were for, and now we're reaping the consequences. The science backs this up. Every single metric we use to measure well-being improves when a dog enters someone's life. Blood pressure drops, cortisol levels decrease, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, spikes, heart rate variability improves, the immune system strengthens. The vagus nerve, which controls your parasympathetic nervous system, becomes more regulated and resilient. It's not subtle, it's not marginal, it's measurable, reproducible, and undeniable. And it happens almost immediately. Within minutes of petting a dog, your physiology changes. Your nervous system downshifts from threat detection mode into safety mode. Your brain stops running the narrative of danger and scarcity. You become capable of being present, of thinking clearly, of feeling less alone. If this were a medication, it would be hailed as a miracle drug. If this were a therapy, it would be prescribed to every person struggling with mental health. But because it's a dog, something alive, something that requires commitment and presence and genuine relationship, we've managed to overlook it. We've treated it as a luxury instead of a necessity. Let me tell you something that might sound controversial. The rise of anxiety disorders, depression, and what we're calling disconnection syndrome in the past 50 years correlates almost perfectly with the reduction in multi-generational households, the increase in isolated living arrangements, and the cultural shift away from animal companionship as a norm. We didn't just lose dogs, we lost something fundamental about how humans are supposed to exist in the world. The Sumerians knew this. The ancient world knew this. Indigenous cultures across the globe knew this. Your own body knows this. The only thing that doesn't know this is the narrative we've been sold about who we should be and how we should live. And here's the thing that really gets me. You can feel this truth right now if you want to. You don't need to read another study or find another piece of evidence. If you've ever been around a dog, truly present with a dog, you felt that shift, that moment where your shoulders drop, where your breathing slows, where the constant evaluation and judgment in your mind quiets down just a little bit. That's not coincidence. That's recognition. That's your deepest self acknowledging something it's always known. We were built for this. We were built to exist in relationship with something that loves without condition, something that doesn't care about your productivity or your success or your status, something that just wants to be in your presence. The Sumerian tablet that mentions dogs being placed with humans, and this is critical, was discovered in a context of medical and protective knowledge. It wasn't buried in mythology or religious text alone. It was preserved alongside practical information about healing, about safeguarding human life, about maintaining the health of communities. They didn't make the distinction between the spiritual and the practical that we do. They understood that sometimes the most practical thing is also the most profound. So when they wrote about dogs being placed with us, they were documenting something they saw working in real time, something observable, something that made the difference between a person who was isolated and dying and a person who was surviving and contributing to their community. They were leaving us a note, a message across 10,000 years saying, "This matters. Don't forget this. When you're alone and afraid and the weight gets too heavy, remember that something can carry part of it with you." Now, if you want to dive much deeper into this and explore the archaeological evidence, the psychological research, and the historical documentation that connects these ideas together, there's a resource in the description and in the pinned comment that goes way beyond what I can cover in a single video. It's worth your time if this resonates with you. But here's what I want you to understand right now. The guardians are still here. They're waiting in shelters. They're living in homes without the recognition of what they truly are. And they're still doing their job, still protecting us from our greatest vulnerability, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether they work. The evidence is overwhelming on that front. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to continue accepting the narrative that you should be fine alone, that needing something is weakness? Or are you going to recognize what the Sumerians knew, that some of our greatest strength comes from admitting we're not meant to walk this path solo? If you're reading this and you're struggling, if you're lonely or anxious or feel like something fundamental is missing from your existence, I want you to know that the answer might not be something you need to fix about yourself. It might be something you need to add to your life, something living, something that asks nothing but presence, something that's been waiting for you for 10,000 years. If you're in a position to bring a dog into your life, consider what that really means. It's not about having a pet. It's about reclaiming something ancient and true about who you are as a human being. It's about accepting protection instead of trying to do everything alone. And if bringing a dog into your life isn't possible right now, maybe you're in a situation where it's not practical or feasible, then at least do this. Recognize the truth of what I'm telling you. Understand that the need you feel for connection isn't a flaw in your character. It's evidence that you're human. It's the blueprint showing you what's missing. And then find ways to honor that need, whether through relationships, community, or whatever form of genuine connection you can cultivate. The Sumerians were trying to tell us something. They were leaving a breadcrumb trail across millennia. Not, here's a story about magic dogs, but here's what we learned about the structure of human well-being, and it involves something that loves without condition. They were scientists of the soul, and they were documenting something observable and true. The real mystery isn't whether dogs are guardians. The mystery is why we've collectively decided to ignore the guardians that have been standing with us all along. Why we've built a world that tells us we should be fine without them. Why we've created a narrative of strength that requires isolation, when the evidence of our own physiology tells us the opposite. That's what lives in those ancient texts. Not magic, just truth, the kind that's been waiting for us to be ready to see it. If this perspective has shifted something for you, if you're starting to see the animals in your life or the potential for that connection differently, then I'd encourage you to explore this further. Check out the resource in the pinned comment or the channel description for the full research, the documented studies, and the historical evidence that backs all of this up. It's comprehensive, it's grounded, and it might be exactly what you need to understand why this matters so much. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring ideas that textbooks leave out and truths that history has been trying to preserve. If this resonated with you, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we dive into the next mystery. There's always another story waiting, another piece of ancient wisdom that changes how we see the world today. I'll see you in the next one.